Mate, we all have no grip. You all need to leave a little bit of space.
Yeah, well, what's your board?
Yeah, sure. But expect the next time the same, you know? Good job.
Thanks, man.
You know, approximately the same dialogue has already been in the history of Formula 1. However, it ended in a more interesting way. Let me tell you. In 1993, Japanese Grand Prix ended with the victory of Ayrton Senna. But during the race, the confidently leading Brazilian almost flew off the track several times, trying to overtake Irvine Jordan, who was conducting his debut race. Hot Irishman selflessly fought with the Hills Williams for sixth place, not paying any attention to the leader. A couple of times they almost collided, and after the finish the enraged Senna, accompanied by Norman Howell, PR director of McLaren, and his race engineer Giorgio Ascanelli, came to the Jordan pits to talk to Irvine, who, in the company of Rubens Barrichello and dozen mechanics, was watching the video of the race. Autosport reporter Adam Cooper was also sitting here. As soon as the excited Senna flew into the box, Adam, feeling that smelling in trouble, pressed the record button. And the next day the whole world read and heard on the radio a recording of their quarrel. I won't give here the full transcript of that hassle. Here are just some of the most meaningful phrases from the dialogue between the great Brazilian and the ambitious Irishman.
What the hell do you think you were doing? I was racing. You were racing? Do you know the rules that you are supposed to let the leaders come by when you are a backmarker? If you are gone fast enough, it was no problem. I overtook you, and you went 3 times over the road in front of me at the same place like freaking idiot, where there was oil, and you were throwing stones and all things in front of me for 3 laps. When I took you, you realized I was ahead of you, and when I came up behind Hill, cause he was on slicks and in difficulties, you should have stayed behind me. You took a very big risk to put me out of the race. The steward said, no problem, nothing was wrong. Yeah? You wait till Australia when the stewards will talk to you. Then you tell me if they tell you this. Hey, I'm out there to do the best for me. This is not correct. You want to do well, I understand, cause I've been there, I understand. But it's very unprofessional if you are back marker cause you happen to be lapped. But I'm racing, you just happen to… You are not racing, you are driving like a freaking idiot. You are not racing driver, you are a freaking idiot. You talk, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. You be careful, guy. I will, I'll watch out for you. You're gonna have problems not with me only, but with lots of other guys, also the FIA. Yeah? Good. Yeah, it's good to know that. See you out there.
After that, Senna turned to leave, but then changed his mind. Slamming his left, Ayrton was left-handed, in the face with iron and headed for the door. Surprised Eddie lost his balance and fell onto the table. "You will pay for this," he shouted after the Brazilian. At first, Irvine really threatened to sue the 3-time world champion. But in the end, everything was limited to convening a special meeting of the FIA World Sports Council. After such a high-profile scandal, the federation could no longer stand aside. And a very mild sentence. Senna was suspended for 6 months. The paradox is that if the court has been less disposed towards the Brazilian and imposed on him not a conditional but a real disqualification, this would certainly have saved Senna's life. However, then no one knew this yet. And speaking before the World Council, Senna did his best to save his reputation as a good guy.
Nothing justifies my act, and I don't justify myself either, but what happened during the race is absurd, and no one cared about it at all. That's why I went to talk to him, but stumbling upon a blank wall of misunderstanding. He didn't consider himself guilty, but he didn't even want to think about it, frankly mocking me under the cynical smiles of drunken mechanics. It pissed me off.
By the way, 9 years later, Irvine himself found himself in a similar situation and was indignant about this no less than Ayrton, having fallen after the US Grand Prix 2002 with criticism of Ralf Schumacher.
I can't understand this behavior of a person who is behind a circle. He knew that Hatfield and I were fighting for the position and suddenly decided to verge between us. Not the smartest things to do, but it's normal for Ralph.
It should be noted that for both Senna and Schumacher, fisticuffs at the Suzuka were far from the first. Once in Hockenheim '92, they even almost got into a fight with each other. Senna was enraged by the dangerous maneuvers of the Schumacher, who had already knocked him out of the race in Monte cars 3 weeks before, and only the intervention of third parties prevented the skirmish between the greatest drivers of the 20th century. In January, Ayrton's fighting career began even during his performance in British Formula 4 in 1981. The young Senna, or rather than Da Silva, rushed with his fists at his teammate Enrico Mansell, who cut him off on the track, and 6 years later at the Spa, Ayrton himself became the victim of an attack on the pit lane. After Senna collided with Mansell on the first lap of the race, Nigel rushed to the Lotus pits and lashed out at the Brazilian with furious eyes. Mechanics could hardly pull them apart. Senna in this situation found the strength for a joke.
If a guy comes running and grabs your breast, I don't think he came to apologize.
On account of Michael, in addition to skirmishes at the Suzuka and Hockenheim, there are also 2 more incidents that, however, didn't turn into a fight. In 1995, in Monza, Schumacher threw his fist at Hill, who carried him out in Roger, but the judges were able to pull the angry Michael away from Damon, who was in no hurry to get out of the car in time, returning to the pit lane, rushed to kill, in Michael's own words, the Scot. But Todt and Ferrari mechanics managed to catch the fault killer right at the McLaren pits. If we recall the events at Suzuka, then literally 10 years after the clash between Senna and Irvine, another story happened on the same track. Shortly after the race, upset by the defeat in the championship, Raikkonen approached Schumacher. "You were my idol, but I had to see how you behave," he said to German. Schumacher, who was in excellent spirit after the victory, at first missed Kimi's words past his ears. Finn repeated his statement several times, and then suddenly grabbed his opponent by the breasts. Schumacher in turn flared up, and fight broke out between the drivers. The mechanics of Ferrari and McLaren rushed to separate the troublemakers. However, both the champion and the vice-champion of the world still managed to give each other a couple of slaps in the face. It was possible to finally stop the brawl and reconcile the fighters only after the intervention of Jean Todt. Both teams and the FIA tried to keep the incident under wraps, and they probably would have succeeded if it were not for percents of Canadian reporters, who the very next day told the world about the racing incident at the Suzuka. If we talk about the rebels of Formula 1, then according to the first recorded duelist of Formula 1 in the mid-70s, the Briton James Hunt became, who clashed in 1976 in the States with Patrick Depailler and had several more minor skirmishes to his credit. But 6 years later, the glory of the main troublemaker was taken away from him by the Brazilian Nelson Piquet, whose fist fight with the Chilean Eliseo Salazar was seen by BBC viewers live during the broadcast of the 1982 German Grand Prix from Hockenheim.
On the lap 19, the Brabham leading Piquet caught up with Salazar's ATS for a lap and tried to overtake in firmmost curve. But Eliseo behaved rather strangely, especially in relation to Piquet, who at one time helped the rich but by and large untalented Chilean break into Formula 1. Before the turn indicated by the old tires, Salazar went inside and stuck his nose into the side of the Brabham, entering the outside trajectory, setting Piquet into the bump stop. For both, the race was over. The enraged world champion jumped out of the broken car with a bullet, right there on the side of the road without removing his helmet. He rushed with his fists at the Chilean and chased him along the safety lane for quite some time. However, after some time, this ugly story received a very curious continuation. A couple of months later, Nelson's chief mechanic admitted to him that even if the Eliseo hadn't carried him off the track, the Brazilian was still doomed to failure. The engine would certainly not have reached the finish line. Upon learning of this, Piquet immediately grabbed the phone, dialed Salazar's number, and Thanks Chilean for saving the BMW from the shameful engine explosion at the home Grand Prix.
Yeah, sometimes the intensity of the struggle on the track is too high even for the psyche of the such trained people as Grand Prix drivers. When the nerves fail, the racers rush to each other with their fists. But then, as a rule, they put up and continue to communicate with each other quite normally in the future. Remaining enemies in their big circus is too dangerous.